Alright, hi guys. Today I'm going to do an example of my own independent reading blog. I'm going to use two novels as an example because um, I'm a quick reader, maybe, and because I want to talk about these two. I think they're both really interesting. I've read them recently as well. So let's say the first one I'm going to talk about today is a novel that I picked up in year 12 and I read a bit of it and I put it down because I couldn't understand the language and I was just like, nope, I'm not reading that again. And this year I've decided to study it with my year 11s. And you probably heard of it. It's called The Great Gatsby, a very famous American novel. So, The Great Gatsby, I mean, it was written in 1925. Around that time it was published. And that was a time in America where Wall Street was booming. They had just technically won the First World War, the Americans. So things were looking pretty good in America. And people believed in this idea of the American dream. And that's what's really central to this book. And what Fitzgerald, the author, is saying is that this American dream actually isn't as good as people think it is. And he uses the main character of Gatsby and the narrator, whose name is Nick, to show this aspect of the American dream. One thing I love about this novel, now that I've read it properly as a more mature person, is the type of language that Fitzgerald, the author, uses. Even though it's a novel and it's 115 pages long, the language he uses is almost like poetry, and it's in a very impressionistic style. So it's not every single detail is given, but what is given is very poetic, it's very lyrical. Some of my most favourite lines, one of my most favourite lines ever in literature is the last line of this novel. And it goes, so we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. And if you know your poetic technique stuff, you'll know that just that one sentence, incorporates so many beautiful language techniques. And this comes through in all his writing. So while the characters of the Great Gatsby, particularly Daisy, who's quite a shallow, materialistic character, even though these characters aren't beautiful, the writing in the novel is. The main ideas of this novel, I guess, are materialism, so people only focusing on wealth and possessions. Another idea, I suppose, is how people can't ascend their social status. Gatsby wants to be part of this upper class, but he can't because he's just born a farmer, a poor farmer. And no matter how hard he tries, he can't get into that upper class. There's the idea of sexuality as well. Lots of gender stereotypes being played in this novel, which are really interesting. And another idea would possibly be the forces of capitalism and how these are leading to a more sort of empty, money-driven and superficial society. So even though it was written in the 1920s, there are some real similarities with today that you can draw. And of course, it's meant to be a love story about Gatsby for Daisy, but really, I think Gatsby's more in love with the idea of Daisy and the money that she represents rather than genuinely feeling emotion for her. And there was a movie adaptation of this novel, which is great. There's a few of them, but this one's got Leo, so that's a win already. And it's got Joel Edgerton, he's an Australian actor, so is Isla Fisher, and Nick Carraway, Spider-Man. So yeah, great film. I would suggest watching it and reading the novel if you ever get the time. And yeah, I get Leo again just because he's beautiful and makes a great Gatsby, I think, in the film, in Baz Luhrmann's film, an Australian director. Anyway, so now I want to move on to my second novel, which is called The Song of Achilles. Hopefully you all know who Achilles is. He's Brad Pitt. Yep, in the film Troy. Oop. So, The Song of Achilles is super interesting. It's written by an American author, Madeline Miller, and it retells the story of the Iliad. So, the Iliad is that whole Troy story, okay? The war at Troy, the Trojan horse, all that, shizzle that went down. So, the Iliad is an ancient Greek epic poem by Homer, as seen here. So, this thing's been around for like centuries, okay? And it's still relevant because people are still writing about it, which I find fascinating. And so it's interesting because Madeline Miller, she reinvents the Iliad we're using the perspective of Patroclus, who is kind of like hinted at Achilles' sort of male lover. They kind of fall in love and have this relationship. And so the whole novel is from his perspective, and it gives a really interesting insight, because normally you only see the hero's perspective. You only see, Brad Pitt as Achilles and his story. We don't really see much of Patroclus in their background, whereas this novel does that. And what's interesting is the amount of sort of sexuality that's involved. It's great that nowadays a person can write about a relationship between a man and a man in a novel and not feel subject to any sort of criticism in that way. And so, yeah, again, I suggest you see the film Troy if you haven't, because it's about this story, which is a classic of literature, of Western literature. You've got Eric Bana, Orlando Bloom, Brad Pitt. What more could you really want? And finally, before I end, this book actually really reminds me of another book I read recently called Ransom by David Malouf. These two are actually really similar because they're both stories about the Iliad. Whereas Ransom, again, this guy's an Australian author, awesome author. Ransom's about sort of the Iliad, but it kind of takes a section of the Iliad where Priam, the Trojan king, has to go, pay a ransom for the dead body of his son. Not really spoilers, the story's been around for like hundreds of centuries. So yeah, and this story goes into that part of the Iliad, only that little part, and it gives us a real insight into who Priam was, who Achilles was, and so it's a sort of a modern trend now to take old texts and reinvent them and make them more interesting for modern audiences. So that's my video. I've gone way over time, but hopefully I've given you some ideas. Yeah, enjoy.